Danganronpa.
Spike Chunsoft's acclaimed visual novel murder mystery series Danganronpa pits a group of high school students against each other in a game where killing your fellow classmates is your only chance for survival. Sound intense? Well, just you wait. The story goes like this. 15 students from Hope's Peak Academy, a school where every student is the ultimate in their respective talents, wake up trapped inside their school. In order to escape, the sadistic teddy bear Monokuma forces them to participate in the killing school life, where they must murder a fellow student and get away with it to be set free from the school. However, after a murder occurs, a class trial follows, where the students must collectively come to a conclusion on who the murderer is. If they guess correctly, the murderer is executed and the rest of the students survive but continue to remain captive inside the school. If they should guess incorrectly, the murderer gets to walk free and the rest of the students are executed. Danganronpa 2 follows the same basic plot. However, rather than taking place inside Hope's Peak Academy itself, it's set on the tropical Jabberwock Island after the events of the first game. And although perpetually dismayed by their situation and vowing never to commit murder, one by one, students carry out this horrible deed to risk their lives for their freedom. While murder for the sake of winning one's own freedom seems like a selfish end, some characters in the series do not see the selfishness in sacrificing themselves, or others, for the greater survival of the class. For this video, I want to focus on one pivotal character in particular, Danganronpa 2's Nagito Komaeda. But before we dive into our analysis of Nagito, we should first define the ethical theory we will be using as a lens for examination. I'm specifically talking about utilitarian ethics. Now load up your truth bullets because this class trial billowing with hope and despair has begun. While we're on the topic of it, what is utilitarianism anyway? Perhaps it has something to do with that meme. The one about the trolley and the people tied to the tracks. Wait, isn't that the ethical theory some people use to justify torture?
No, that's wrong!
Well, Kazuichi, that's not quite right. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what utilitarian ethics looks like. Like the popular trolley problem meme. Believe it or not, that is an actual illustration of the basic idea of utilitarianism. The problem states that a trolley is heading down a track on a collision course to hit a group of 5 people tied to the track. However, you have the power to pull the lever and switch the tracks so that the train now only hits 1 person tied to the track instead of the 5. Sounds like a tough choice, right? Doesn't it seem like the best solution is to just walk away and not get involved? According to traditional utilitarianism, it is morally good to pull the lever and spare the 5 people at the cost of the 1 person. This may seem harsh, but let me explain this a little more in depth. See, utilitarian ethics has its roots in hedonism, an ethical theory developed by 19th century ethicist Jeremy Bentham. Hedonism describes human ethics at its most basic level as pleasure-seeking versus pain-avoiding. In other words, our most basic instincts are to seek things that are pleasurable to us and avoid things that are painful. Therefore, human ethics is based on maximizing pleasure for ourselves and minimizing pain. One of Bentham's students, a man by the name of John Stuart Mill, took this idea a step further to create the modern ethical theory of utilitarianism. Mill extrapolated hedonism past pleasure versus pain on the individual level to focus on people as a whole. He also replaced pleasure and pain with happiness and suffering. For Mill, doing good meant maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people, while minimizing suffering for the greatest number of people. You can see how this could be used to justify torture. We could torture 1 prisoner of war to get him to spill enemy secrets that could lead to a quick end of the war, and thus minimize the suffering the greater war has caused. But then we'd be causing suffering to the prisoner being tortured. However, modern utilitarians reject this idea, arguing that we must not consider merely the number of people whose pain would be minimized versus the number who would have to suffer. but rather to what degree they would have to suffer when considering what the benefit is to those who would not suffer. For example, if the FBI placed a wiretap in every single person's home in a given city because they had received a tip that there might be a crooked businessman in the city that is laundering money, this would clearly impose much more suffering on the innocent people of the city who have now lost their privacy than the level of suffering the criminal has caused to the economy by their dishonest financial practices, even though their shady economic practices would likely affect an equal if not larger number of people. So under this interpretation of utilitarian ethics, torture would not be justified because the severe suffering that would be caused to an individual would not actually outweigh the lessened suffering of the larger group. Now with that out of the way, let's apply these ideas to the situation the students of Hope's Peak Academy have been put in. The overarching struggle of Danganronpa is the idea of hope versus despair. While Monokuma seeks to instill despair throughout the students by forcing them to kill each other, they must cling to hope and place trust in one another in order to survive this horrific event. The dichotomy between hope and despair replaces the traditional utilitarian dichotomy of happiness and suffering. All of the students of Hope's Peak Academy who suffer through Monokuma's killing school life or killing school trip must grapple with maximizing hope for themselves, as well as the larger group, and even the world, as we find out the world has been plunged into despair in what is known as the biggest, most awful, most tragic event in human history brought on by Monokuma. One student in particular has a distinct obsession with creating hope and crushing despair. That's right, it's Nagito Komaeda. Nagito, whose talent is the ultimate lucky student, claims to stand as a tool for creating hope for the world, and he believes that the creation of hope for the world rests on the survival of the ultimate students. However, he is frequently self-deprecating in his quest to create hope, claiming that he is a nobody compared to the other true ultimates, since his talent is just being lucky enough to be randomly selected to attend the academy. His fetishization of hope leads him even as far as being willing to help commit murder or die himself if it would help the other students band together for the sake of hope. He believes that if they can band together, they can find a way to get off the island. But this extreme desire brands Nagito as kind of a loose cannon amongst the group. They even go so far as to tie him up on one occasion to prevent him from doing anything insane. But is Nagito's belief in sacrificing the few to create hope for the greater good of the group justified? It would seem as though his own willingness to die for the sake of hope would be noble or even virtuous to the utilitarian. However, when it comes to committing murder for the same cause, the waters become much more muddied. Think back to the trolley problem for a moment. When it came down to simply pulling a lever to switch the tracks, the decision to do so seemed easier to make since we knew someone had to die, and it made sense that we should save the greater number of people. Think of this as similar to Nagito's openness to aid in murder. Since he knows the murder is inevitable, he's willing to participate in it in order to use it as a tool to create hope by creating a reason for the students to band together. But what if we were to frame the trolley problem differently? What if instead of 2 different tracks and a lever, there's just one track with 5 people tied to it? However, there's a very large person who, if pushed, would fall onto the tracks and whose size would be enough to stop the train. Would it be morally justified to willingly sacrifice an innocent person who is not in any other danger otherwise to save the 5 people tied to the track? This is essentially the version of the problem that Nagito faces. Is actively killing someone justified if it saves a greater number of lives than those lost? The utilitarian would actually say no. It would not be morally correct in this situation because the one who would have to die, or those who would be saved, may not necessarily share the same moral viewpoint as the utilitarian, and it would not be fair to use them as pawns for a greater goal if they do not share it. Yes, the other students believe that hope is necessary to triumph over despair, but they do not share Nagito's view that the despair of murder will lead to the creation of hope. However, that's not the end. There's one more action Nagito takes that poses a huge ethical question for utilitarians. Now the video is gonna get real spoilery, so just be prepared. Towards the end of the game, Nagito alone earns access to some crucial details of the killing school trip they've been thrown into. He learns the truth, that they are not in the real world, but in fact in a computer simulation of the real world. Not only is this world not real, but the students are not who they think they are. They are actually a dangerous group of individuals known as the Remnants of Despair, Hope's Peak Academy students who had been so corrupted by the despair of the biggest, most awful, most tragic event that they became the embodiments of despair themselves. They had been put into this simulation in order to wipe their memories of the tragedy and rehabilitate them to the point where they could be released back into the real world. However, Monokuma got in the way of that happening. After learning this truth, Nagito decides that these students are in fact a threat to the hope of the world, and devises a plan to kill himself and frame it as a murder that is unsolvable. This would result in the failure to identify the killer at the class trial, and if you remember from earlier, this results in the executions of everyone but the murderer. The question now is, would the sacrifice of these 15 students be justified if it helped prevent the world from falling deeper into despair? Surely the magnitude of this crisis must warrant some level of sacrifice in order to protect hope. Now let's start our closing argument and see how this all comes together.
Here's everything that happened in this case.
The answer here is actually still no. As the game's conclusion shows us, the power to create hope lies within one's ability to decide their own fate and shape the future they want to have. While speaking strictly in terms of utility, Nagito's plan would have theoretically prevented much more suffering than it caused, but it failed to give the rest of the students a chance to learn the truth for themselves, and in turn shape their own futures, which would have created more hope than killing them would have minimized despair. Eventually, the gang of students are able to solve Nagito's unsolvable murder and learn the truth of their situation. This leads them to strive to change their path of despair and walk a path of hope instead, highlighting one of the flaws of utilitarianism. Nagito is able to calculate the utility of sacrificing the few to create what he thought would be hope for the world, but doing so fails to consider the reaction of those who would be sacrificed. Nagito could not account for the individual wills of the other students who, upon learning the truth of their past selves, strive to prevent themselves from reverting to that state. So while Nagito may have believed his actions to be morally good and noble, his failure to account for the effects of his actions on the wills of those being affected means that he did not properly judge the severity of the suffering he would cause, resulting in what would actually be an immoral choice according to the utilitarian. Thank you so much for watching my video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I was really excited about making this one because I love Danganronpa. If you'd like to see more from me, you can hit the subscribe button, and while you're down there, be sure to check out the link to my Twitch channel. I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. PST.